Welcome back. So President Cyril Ramaphosa has hailed former U.S. President Jimmy Carter as an outspoken critic of apartheid. He died at his Georgia home at the age of 100 yesterday, surrounded by family. U.S. President Joe Biden has directed that the 9th of January be a national day of mourning. Carter served as the 39th president from for one term, from 1977 up until 1981. He was the longest living president in U.S. history. Well, international relations expert Brooks Spector joins us now to give us a little bit more perspective on the life that was Jimmy Carter. Brooks, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. 100 years. I mean, when I saw the report yesterday, I thought to myself, that is quite a life lived. Your initial reaction hearing of the news of the passing of Jimmy Carter?
Well, good evening. Good to be with you. My initial reaction was, I'm sorry that he has passed away, but he did indeed live a long, productive, mostly happy, and certainly in terms of doing what he did, a giving life rather than a taking life. I mean, this is a man who came into office as president after one term as governor of the state of Georgia, basically being a neophyte to Washington. And he replaced, he came just after Richard Nixon had resigned in disgrace, and there was the interregnum with Gerald Ford as a non-elected but appointed president. And Carter's first reaction was, "I'm never going to lie to you." And I mean, that's, in a way, that's an impossible thing to say, but he tried pretty hard to live up to that, and to give people a sense that integrity was once again back in the White House, and that his actions as president and the government that he led would be guided by that kind of perspective rather than crass political circumstances.
Yeah.
If we had to evaluate the single most remarkable achievement, and this has been commented on by many people, so what I'm going to say is not a secret.
Sure.
It's the achievement of the Camp David Accord between Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel that ended a relationship that had led to 4 separate wars over several decades, and it still remains in force. The Israelis surrendered the Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptians agreed to recognize Israel and to allow safe passage through the Suez Canal. And there has been no fighting between those two nations. And from ancient, certainly long-time enemies, this was a remarkable achievement, and it is almost entirely a function of his diligence in taking those two men up to Camp David, which was, let's say, 80 miles outside of Washington, up in the Catoctin Mountains, and basically making them stay there until they hammered out an agreement. And it was a remarkable tour de force on the part of a man who knew all the details, at least as well as the two suspicious leaders from the respective countries. But there are other things that were achieved, and they sometimes get overlooked as a result of that one achievement. There was an agreement with the Soviet Union, the START agreement on nuclear limitations on nuclear missiles and weapons, that although the American Congress ultimately didn't ratify it, the two countries followed it for years as if it had been ratified. Carter completed the formal diplomatic relationship between the United States and China, and something which I don't see much of in the media so far. Yeah. He introduced into American foreign policy a serious understanding of the importance of human rights. An office was set up in the State Department to monitor human rights around the world. The annual Human Rights Report was begun at his initiative, and it's now essentially a kind of a Bible for countries all over the place, NGOs and advocacy groups, comes out every year and covers the circumstances of every country on the planet. And in domestic policy terms, established the Energy Department and the Department of Education, and something that we notice importantly now, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which responds to natural disasters. And I guess we should also mention that one of the achievements was the treaty with Panama to cede the Panama Canal and the surrounding territory over to Panama. And that's gotten in the news recently, too, courtesy of Donald Trump. But to be fair, the Panama Canal is operated by the Panamanians in a responsible and impeccable manner, even. And it prevented the kind of hostilities that would have occurred in many Latin American nations if such a transfer had not happened.
Yeah.
So there are lots of positives to talk about.
Yeah.
We can also talk about everything that happened after he was president as well, along with what brought him low in the election of 1980, if you wish.
Yeah, and I want to get into that a little bit later about, I suppose the end of his presidency and some of the challenges that he faced at the end. But if we stick to the achievements that you talk about, I mean, those aren't small achievements for international relations by any shape or form. The Camp David Accord of 1978 and then the de-escalation of the Cold War, massive achievements. And then when you think about the fact that he lived such a long life, I wonder about the sort of interaction, if at all, he would have had with the leaders in the past few years, perhaps, of the US and how they deal with international relations. Here in South Africa, for a long time, there has been a discussion around, establishing and really listening to the elders of the nation, if you will. Was he afforded that platform?
Well, he had a cordial relationship with Joseph Biden, and Biden, in his statements about Carter's passing, made sure to point out that after all, he knew him for something along the lines of 50 years. Biden had come to Washington as a very young man, 29-year-old senator, and that was even before Carter had been elected president. So they knew each other from the get-go, as we would say. I don't know that his relationship with Barack Obama was as close, but it was certainly cordial. And I believe that over time, he also had a strong personal bond with George Herbert Walker Bush, perhaps not the son, George W. Bush, but certainly George Herbert Walker Bush, even if the policies of the two administrations were somewhat different. Interestingly, both Bush and Carter were only one-term presidents and were defeated in their reelection. The things that brought him down were a curious collection of things. On the one hand, there was high inflation in the United States, and that meant interest rates for loans were similarly high. There was a shortage of petrol, occasioned in part by the revolution in Iran and the disruptions to supplies. And of course, inevitably, we have to talk about it, the capture and the hostage taking of dozens of American diplomats and technical personnel in the embassy in Tehran after the fall of the Shah and his replacement by Ayatollah Khomeini as a result of a student revolt. And the captivity of those individuals lasted over a year, 444 days, and the collective those things collectively made it very difficult for anybody supporting Jimmy Carter to be able to answer Ronald Reagan's pointed question: "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" And Jimmy Carter was also wounded by the decision of Ted Kennedy, senator from Massachusetts, to run against him in primaries to become the Democratic nominee as well. And a party that is split that way very rarely succeeds at the voting booth.
Yeah, we were talking about a presidency that was a long time ago. So for some of us, a little bit of a history lesson, Brooks, if you'll agree, because I look up and I see that just a day after his inauguration back in '77, he went about making the drastic decision of pardoning those who had evaded being drafted to the Vietnam War. I mean, that must have been quite the move back then for people to think about in the US in the '70s.
Well, it was. I mean, it wasn't as divisive as some people thought. After all, very few of those people were individual, or very few, perhaps none, were individuals who'd taken up arms against the United States. Most of them were people who had fled to Canada to resist the draft, or had found some other way of protesting, or had even in some few cases perhaps gone into hiding. But by then, of course, the Vietnam conflict, there were very few people left in the United States who thought the Vietnam War had been a good idea and well carried out. That ship had sailed, put it that way. Still, I mean, there were people who were angry that protesters were not. They did not have to continue to take punishment or exile. But on the whole, I think that contributed more to healing than to hurting.
Right. Right. This is the winner of the 2002 Nobel Peace Prize. And then, of course, we know that the 9th of January is set to be a day of mourning, as announced by current U.S. President Joe Biden. And he's also ordered that flags be flown at half-mast from Sunday up until that date, that is the 9th of January. I think for leaders globally, because obviously these observations up until the 9th will be taking place across various parts of the world, and I can just imagine what conversations would be looking like in a country like Russia, for instance, or Egypt, and even Israel, as you talk about some of those highlights of his presidency. But what leaders current day should be taking home from the life and times of Jimmy Carter as a parting shot, Brooks?
A certain amount of humility as a leader, I think, is a lesson you can draw from Jimmy Carter's life, both before president, as president, and certainly in the decades afterwards, where he did all manner of important and useful humanitarian things, ranging from helping with Habitat for Humanity, for the defeat of the guinea worm and a number of other diseases in West Africa, election observations in over 100 elections around the world, all that. But I think we really have to point to his humility before the idea of being in power. Remember, this is a man who, for decades after he left office, every Sunday morning he would preach, he would deliver a Sunday school lesson in his neighborhood church, as if he were simply one more local member of that community. And there are all kinds of photographs of him going grocery shopping and things like that. Yep. So it's, he's the kind of person, or was, I guess we have to say now, who we have to think of as a servant leader or a citizen leader, rather than somebody who revels in all the baubles and the gold braid and the parades and the drums and bugles and all that stuff, and the gaudiness that goes with being in charge. Yeah. It's not a popular feeling for a lot of leaders. They love to be seduced by the office they occupy. But Carter is an example of somebody who managed to do that without losing his personal integrity.
Yeah, I see one piece that's written: Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer who won the presidency. We really appreciate your time, Brooks. Thank you so much for speaking to us.